When you walk away peacefully, something very specific happens inside an avoidance heart that almost no one talks about because it doesn't explode immediately. It doesn't look dramatic and it doesn't announce itself with tears or panic. It arrives quietly, slowly, and far later than you would expect. And this is why so many people misunderstand avoidance and assume that your calm exit meant nothing to them, when in reality, it may have been the most destabilizing emotional moment of their inner life, because avoidants are wired to respond to pressure, intensity, and emotional pursuit, not silence, not dignity, not self contained peace. So when you leave without begging, without accusations, without emotional collapse, their nervous system doesn't register danger in the way it's trained to. And instead of activating their familiar defenses, it freezes because the usual script is missing. There is no chaos to react against, no emotional storm to shut down from. And in that absence, their mind initially interprets your calm as proof that they were right all along, that the connection wasn't that deep, that you didn't need them, that walking away was easy for you. And for a brief moment, this gives them a sense of relief, a false calm, like finally exhaling after holding their breath. But this relief is shallow and temporary because it is built on avoidance, not resolution. Once the silence stretches longer than expected, once days pass without emotional fallout, once they realize you are not circling back, not sending long messages, not trying to be understood, something inside them begins to shift because peaceful absence does something arguments never could. It removes the emotional noise they relied on to stay disconnected. And without that noise, their internal world gets louder. Memories surface uninvited. Moments they minimized replay with new weight. And the heart they've kept guarded starts to feel things without being prompted, without being chased. And that is deeply unsettling for someone who learned early on that closeness equals loss of control, because now they are feeling closeness after you are gone, and there is nothing they can do about it. What happens is subtle but powerful because avoidants don't miss in the way. Anxious people do. They don't ache immediately, they don't spiral outward. Instead, the ache moves inward. It shows up as restlessness, distraction, a vague sense that something is, and they may not even consciously connect it to you at first. They tell themselves they are just tired, bored, or stressed. But what is really happening is that your peaceful exit has removed the emotional tension they used to justify staying detached. And now there is no external reason for their numbness. So the numbness begins to feel uncomfortable rather than protective. And this is when your absence starts to feel loud, not because you demanded space in their mind, but because you left it empty. And emptiness is something avoidants struggle with far more than conflict, because conflict gives them something to push against, something to blame, something to use as emotional armor. But peace offers no such protection. And in that peace, they begin to feel the weight of what was real between you, not in a romanticized fantasy way yet, but in a quiet, unsettling realization that something stable has disappeared, and stability is far more threatening to an avoidant than drama, because stability requires presence, accountability, and emotional awareness, all things they were never taught how to hold safely. The avoidant heart begins to revisit moments they once brushed off, not the fights, not the intense emotional exchanges, but the small human moments, the way you listened without trying to fix them, the way you didn't demand more than they could give, the way you stayed regulated, even when they pulled away. And this is where something important happens, because for the first time, they feel loss without anger attached to it. And that is a foreign emotional experience. There is no narrative of you being too much, no storyline where they can frame themselves as the victim of emotional overwhelm. Your peaceful departure removes their ability to externalize responsibility, and instead the feeling turns inward, not as self-blame yet, but as curiosity, a quiet wondering of why this feels different from other endings, why this one lingers without sharp edges. And that curiosity is dangerous for an avoidant, because curiosity opens the door to emotional processing. And emotional processing leads to grief, and grief requires staying present with feelings instead of running from them. And this is why avoidants often take much longer to realize what you meant to them, because their heart only feels safe enough to open once the perceived threat of closeness is gone. Something even deeper begins to surface, a delayed grief that doesn't look like sadness at first, but manifests as nostalgia, idealization, and comparison. They may start measuring new interactions against the emotional safety you provided, not the intensity, not the chemistry, but the quiet sense of being accepted without being cornered. And this is where your peaceful exit becomes transformative. Because you didn't just leave a void, you left a standard. And that standard now lives inside them, influencing how they experience connection moving forward, whether they are conscious of it or not. And this is often when avoidants feel an unexpected sense of guilt, not because you accused them, but because you didn't. Guilt that arises without external pressure is one of the hardest emotions for an avoidant to process because it can't be deflected, it can't be argued with, it simply exists. And it asks them to sit with the reality that someone offered them emotional safety and walked away intact. And that realization can quietly dismantle the defenses they spent years building. The most profound shift occurs. And this is where the title truly comes to life. Because what happens in an avoidance heart when you walk away peacefully is not regret in the traditional sense. It is an awakening, slow, uneven, and often painful, but real. Your calm exit becomes a mirror they can't unsee, reflecting both what they received and what they were unable to give. And whether they reach out again or never speak to you, the internal change still happens because you showed them a version of connection that didn't chase, didn't collapse, and didn't abandon itself. And that leaves a lasting imprint. One that challenges their belief that love must be overwhelming to be real. And this is why walking away peacefully is not passive, it is powerful. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand validation. It simply allows the truth to rise on its own time inside a heart that was never taught how to feel safely while someone stayed. And the most important part is this: the transformation happens regardless of the outcome because your peace was never about changing them. It was about honoring yourself. And paradoxically, that is what makes it unforgettable. After the initial awakening settles in, the avoidant heart moves into a phase that feels deceptively calm on the surface, but internally, it is anything but settled because now the mind starts trying to regain control over what the heart has begun to feel. And this is where rationalization kicks in hard. They replay the ending and tell themselves that your peaceful exit meant you had already emotionally checked out, that you were stronger because you cared less, that the connection simply ran its course. And this mental narrative becomes a shield, not against you, but against the vulnerability they don't know how to hold. Because accepting that your calm departure came from self-respect rather than indifference would force them to confront something far more uncomfortable. The realization that emotional safety was present and they still retreated. And so they stay busy, distract themselves, pour energy into work, routines, or surface level connections, all while a quiet hum of unrest lingers underneath because avoidance doesn't erase feelings, it only delays them. And what is delayed eventually returns with more weight, especially when there is no emotional chaos to blame for its existence. As time moves forward, and this is where the avoidant nervous system starts associating your absence with emotional safety rather than threat. And that may sound contradictory, but it's deeply important. Because while you were present, closeness activated fear, expectations, and pressure, even if you weren't applying any. But once you left peacefully, the threat response calmed down. And in that calm, the heart finally had room to feel what it couldn't before. And this is when missing you becomes less about attachment and more about meaning. They don't miss conversations or routines as much as they miss how regulated they felt around you without realizing it. How your presence didn't demand performance, how your acceptance didn't come with emotional debt, and this realization often arrives quietly at night, in moments of stillness when distractions fade and the body remembers before the mind does. And this is why avoidants often feel emotions somatically first, as heaviness in the chest, a sense of longing without a clear object, because the heart is processing something the mind hasn't yet allowed into conscious awareness, comparison begins. And this is one of the most revealing stages because every new interaction becomes a subtle contrast. They may meet people who are more emotionally expressive, more available on the surface, but something feels off, too loud, too fast, too demanding. And they can't quite explain why, because what they are really missing is the absence of pressure you brought into their emotional world. And this is when they start realizing that what you offered was rare, not because you were perfect, but because you didn't try to control their emotions. And this creates a strange internal conflict. On one hand, they crave the familiarity of distance. On the other, they now recognize the cost of it. And this tension is exhausting because once awareness is introduced, the old patterns no longer feel fully comfortable, but new patterns still feel unsafe. And this is the emotional limbo many avoidants sit in after losing someone who walked away with peace rather than pain, where guilt evolves into self-reflection. And this is a turning point because guilt that comes from accusation leads to defensiveness, but guilt that arises from silence leads to introspection. They begin to wonder what role they played, not in a self-critical spiral, but in a quiet questioning of their patterns, why closeness feels overwhelming, why they shut down when things are stable, why they felt safer after you left than when you stayed. And these questions don't always lead to immediate change, but they plant seeds that disrupt the old belief that independence means emotional isolation. And this is often when avoidants experience a subtle identity shift because they start seeing themselves not just as someone who values space, but as someone who may have learned to survive by keeping their heart at arm's length. And that realization can be both liberating and terrifying because it suggests that connection doesn't have to cost them their autonomy, but it also means they would have to unlearn behaviors that once kept them safe. Something deeply human happens, acceptance, not necessarily acceptance of the loss, but acceptance of the truth that your peaceful exit wasn't a rejection, it was a boundary, and boundaries feel different than abandonment. They don't activate panic, they activate reflection. And this is why your departure continues to echo long after the relationship ends, because it didn't confirm their fears about love being chaotic or consuming. It challenged them, and whether they consciously acknowledge it or not, their heart carries that challenge forward, influencing how they approach intimacy in the future, how they respond to emotional safety, and how they interpret calmness and connection. And even if they never reach out, even if your paths never cross again, the imprint remains. Because peaceful endings don't close chapters, they leave questions. And those questions live on in the quiet spaces where avoidance no longer feels like protection, but like a choice that can finally be examined. As the internal conflict deepens to take shape, and this is where the avoidant heart feels divided against itself, because now there is a pull in two opposite directions happening at the same time. One part of them wants to reach out, to reconnect, to test whether the door is still open, while another part is gripped by the old fear that closeness will eventually demand something they don't know how to give. And this push and pull is exhausting because it's no longer driven by external pressure, it's entirely internal, and that makes it harder to escape. They may draft messages they never send, replay conversations in their head, imagine how it would feel to hear your voice again, and then immediately shut those thoughts down, reminding themselves of why distance once felt safer. But the difference now is that distance no longer feels neutral. It feels like a loss, and that awareness changes everything. Because once the heart labels something as loss, it can't unfeel it, even if the mind tries to. Fear becomes more specific. It's no longer a vague discomfort with intimacy, it becomes fear of being seen, fear that if they return, they will be expected to show up differently, to communicate more honestly, to stay present when things get uncomfortable. And that fear isn't irrational because your peaceful exit set a precedent. You showed them that love doesn't beg, doesn't chase, and doesn't tolerate emotional absence indefinitely. And that means if they were to come back, the old dynamic wouldn't work anymore. And this realization is terrifying for an avoidant because it removes the safety of familiarity. They can't return to the version of themselves that stayed detached without consequence. And they can't fully step into a new version without facing vulnerability. And so they linger in hesitation, feeling the weight of both desire and fear, caught between who they were and who they might have to become. Something tender begins to surface beneath the fear, a quiet respect, not just for you, but for the boundary you held. They may not consciously label it as respect, but it shows up in the way they speak about you internally with less dismissal, less minimization, and more acknowledgement of what you offered. They begin to recognize that your calm departure was not weakness, but strength. And that realization can feel humbling because it contrasts sharply with the belief that emotional restraint equals emotional detachment. They start to understand that peace can be a form of power. And this reframes the entire connection in their mind, transforming it from a story of emotional incompatibility into a lesson about emotional maturity. And even if they don't fully accept that lesson yet, it lingers, shaping how they interpret future relationships, how they respond to emotional availability, and how they perceive their own patterns. Longing becomes quieter, but deeper. It's no longer about missing you as a person in their daily life. It's about missing who they were when they felt safe enough not to perform, when they could show up without being pushed, when connection felt spacious rather than suffocating. And this is one of the most painful realizations for an avoidant because it suggests that the version of themselves they felt most regulated around you is now gone, and reclaiming it would require vulnerability, self-awareness, and emotional effort. And that's a journey they may not feel ready to take, but the seed has been planted, and once planted, it grows. Sometimes slowly, sometimes unevenly, but it grows nonetheless, influencing their emotional landscape in ways they can't fully control. The heart reaches a form of integration, not closure, but understanding. They begin to see that your peaceful exit was not the end of something, but the beginning of an internal reckoning, a moment that forced them to confront the limits of avoidance, the cost of emotional distance, and the quiet power of self-respect. And whether they act on this understanding or not, it becomes part of them, shaping their emotional responses, their fears, and their desires moving forward. And this is why peaceful endings are so impactful. They don't create wounds that demand immediate attention. They create mirrors that reflect truth over time. And those mirrors follow the avoidant long after the relationship ends, reminding them gently but persistently that connection doesn't have to be loud to be meaningful, and that sometimes the most profound changes begin not with confrontation, but with a calm, unwavering walk away. Time does something that avoidance can't undo. It removes urgency, and without urgency, the avoidant heart can no longer hide behind survival responses. Weeks or months may pass, and outwardly, they appear fine, functional, even detached, but internally, something has softened. The sharp need to protect themselves at all costs dulls, and in that softer state, memories return without the old defensive framing. Moments with you are no longer filtered through fear or pressure. They are felt as they were, calm, grounding, steady, and this is often when the full emotional weight finally lands, not as panic, but as a deep, quiet grief, the kind that settles into the chest and doesn't demand expression, only acknowledgement. And this grief isn't just about losing you. It's about losing the opportunity to grow alongside someone who didn't threaten their autonomy. And that realization can be more painful than heartbreak itself. These phase brings a subtle but permanent shift in how they experience emotional safety, because once an avoidant has felt connection without coercion, they can't unfeel it. And even if they return to old patterns, those patterns feel less convincing, less absolute. There's now a reference point inside them, a memory of what it felt like to be accepted without being pursued. And this changes their internal compass. They may still choose distance, but they now know the cost of it. And that awareness follows them into every future connection, quietly influencing their reactions, their boundaries, and their fears. And while this doesn't always lead to immediate healing, it does mark the beginning of emotional consciousness, the point where avoidance shifts an unconscious reflex to a choice that can be questioned. Your peaceful exit becomes a story they tell themselves, not aloud, but internally, as a moment that changed how they understand intimacy. They may frame it as timing, as incompatibility, as life pulling people in different directions. But beneath those narratives lives a deeper truth that someone once loved them without losing themselves. And that truth becomes both comforting and confronting. Comforting because it proves connection doesn't have to be overwhelming, confronting, because it highlights the gap between what they want and what they know how to sustain. And this internal story becomes a quiet guide, shaping their expectations and fears in ways they may not consciously recognize, but which surface when they encounter emotional availability again. Something almost paradoxical happens. Your absence becomes integrated into their sense of self, not as a wound, but as a lesson. They begin to understand that being left peacefully was not a punishment. It was an invitation to grow, to reflect, to question the patterns that once felt non-negotiable. And while they may not accept that invitation immediately or ever, it remains open. And this is why peaceful departures linger. They don't close doors with finality. They leave them unlocked, visible, impossible to forget. And the avoidant heart, which once relied on shutting doors to feel safe, now has to live with the awareness that openness exists without chaos. In the final stage, the truth settles fully into place. What happens in an avoidance heart when you walk away peacefully is not collapse, not regret in the dramatic sense, but transformation, slow, internal, and often unseen. Your calm departure becomes the moment their emotional world expanded beyond its familiar limits, showing them that love can be steady, boundaries can be kind, and endings can be dignified. And whether they ever return, whether they ever change, or whether they carry this lesson quietly for the rest of their life, one thing remains certain: you did not leave empty-handed. You left them with awareness. And awareness is the one thing avoidance can never fully escape, because once the heart has been touched by peace, it can no longer pretend that distance is the only way to survive.